the last coin falls. The clatter of chips and a thick haze of tobacco smoke were the constant companions of the Rattlesnake Saloon. Lily, barely tall enough to see over the polished mahogany bar, watched her father from the shadowy corner by the swinging doors. Jedediah Miller, his usual gentle smile replaced by a grimace of concentration, sat hunched over a scarred poker table. The lamplight glinted off the beads of sweat on his brow, reflecting the desperation etched into his features. His stack of silver coins had dwindled to a single, solitary piece. Across from him sat Silas Blackwood, a man whose presence always seemed to chill the air. His eyes, like chips of flint, never left Jed's face. A thin, cruel smile played on Silas's lips as he shuffled his cards with an unnerving slowness. The pile of coins before him rose like a small silver mountain, a stark contrast to Jed's meager offering. Lily's stomach tightened with each drawn-out second. She knew that coin. It was the one he'd promised for her new boots, the ones with the sturdy soles. "All in, Jedediah?" Silas's voice was a low growl, barely audible above the din of the saloon but cutting through the air like a knife. "Or are you folding on a promising hand?" Jed swallowed hard, his gaze flitting from the coin to Silas, then briefly, almost imperceptibly, to Lily's hidden corner. The shame on his face was a bitter thing to witness. He knew he was being watched, and the knowledge seemed to weigh him down further. He picked up the coin, its smooth, cold surface a poor comfort. He rubbed his thumb over the eagle embossed on its face, a gesture of silent prayer. "All in," Jed whispered, his voice hoarse, and with a heavy sigh, he pushed the coin forward. It spun briefly on its edge before falling flat, a final, metallic thud that echoed in Lily's ears. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He laid down his cards, a full house, aces over kings. Jed's shoulders slumped. His own hand, two pair, seemed pitiful in comparison. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fireplace and the distant sound of a harmonica. "Well, Jedediah," Silas purred, sweeping the last coin into his formidable pile. "Looks like your luck has run out. Again." Jed's face was a mask of defeat. I'll get it back, Silas. I promise." Silas leaned back, a predatory gleam in his eye. "Promises don't pay debts, Jed. You owe me a considerable sum now. More than you'll ever earn working that scrubland of yours." He paused, letting the words sink in, twisting the knife. "Unless, there's another way." Jed's head snapped up. "What way?" he asked, a desperate hope flickering in his eyes. Silas's gaze drifted past Jed, landing squarely on Lily. Her blood ran cold. He knew she was there. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. "My nephew, Bartholomew, he's of an age to be thinking of settling down. He needs a good, strong woman to run his household. Someone, amenable." Jed followed Silas's gaze, his eyes widening in horror as he understood. His face, already pale, turned ashen. "No, Silas. Not Lily. Please." "It's a fair trade, Jedediah," Silas countered, his voice losing its pleasant edge. "A daughter for a debt. Bartholomew is a decent man, if a bit particular. She'd be well looked after. And your debt, well, it would be forgotten." Panic seized Jed. The weight of his debt, the fear of Silas's wrath, combined with the sudden, shocking proposition, overwhelmed him. He looked at Lily, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. He saw the terror in her face, mirroring his own. But the choice, in that moment, felt like no choice at all. He was trapped. I agree," Jed stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Lily, she'll marry Bartholomew." The words hung heavy in the smoke-filled air, a death knell for Lily's innocence. Her father had just sold her, for a handful of coins and the promise of a debt erased. A sinking heart. The clatter of her father's dropped pipe echoed in the sudden silence of the cabin, a sound that felt like a hammer striking Lily's chest. "A promise, Lilybell," he'd mumbled, avoiding her gaze, his voice thick with a mixture of shame and desperation. "To Bartholomew. To clear the ledgers." The words, few and heavy, settled upon her like a suffocating shroud. Marriage. To a stranger. A debt repaid with her very life. Her heart, a small, frantic bird, beat against the cage of her ribs, threatening to burst. Despair, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat, stealing the air from her lungs. She stared at the rough-hewn table, the chipped tin plate, the familiar objects of her simple life, now rendered alien by the monstrous decree. Her future, once a hazy, hopeful landscape, had narrowed to a dark, inescapable tunnel. The very next day, the monstrous decree gained a face. Bartholomew. He arrived not with a knock, but with the arrogant push of the saloon doors. He was a man built like a boulder, unyielding and severe, his eyes the color of old river stones, devoid of warmth or curiosity. He didn't offer a greeting, merely a curt nod to her father before his gaze, chillingly possessive, settled on Lily. He looked at her not as a person, but as an acquisition, an item on an inventory list. "She'll do," he'd rumbled, his voice a gravelly monotone, as if assessing livestock. Lily felt a tremor run through her, a visceral revulsion that tightened every muscle. Her hands clenched beneath her apron, nails biting into her palms, a desperate attempt to ground herself against the sudden, overwhelming sensation of being utterly powerless. There was no flicker of understanding, no spark of human connection in his expression, only a calculating assessment that stripped her of her individuality. The news, like a wildfire across dry grass, swept through Redemption Gulch with astonishing speed. Mrs. Henderson, her face a mask of pity and thinly veiled satisfaction, clucked her tongue while purchasing flour. Old man Hemlock, usually taciturn, offered a sympathetic grunt, his eyes darting from Lily to the general store's swinging doors. The children, usually boisterous, quieted their games when she passed, their innocent faces reflecting the hushed whispers of their elders. Lily felt their gazes, 1,000 tiny barbs pricking her skin. Every hurried conversation ceased, every head turned, every sympathetic or speculative glance a fresh brand on her soul. She was no longer Lily, the cooper's daughter, but a commodity, traded for a debt. The weight of their collective judgment and pity pressed down on her, making each step heavy, each breath shallow. The familiar dusty streets, once her refuge, now felt like a prison yard, every face a watchful guard. There was no escape from their scrutiny, no corner where the whispers couldn't reach, no solace from the truth that her life was no longer her own. She was trapped, a bird ensnared, watching the horizon fade. A father's shame. The scent of stale pipe tobacco and unaddressed fear hung heavy in the small, cluttered cabin. Lily found her father hunched over the rough-hewn table, his calloused fingers tracing invisible patterns on the scarred wood. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of the room, mirroring the turmoil in Lily's own heart. "Pa," she began, her voice a fragile whisper against the heavy silence, "you can't do this. You can't. There has to be another way." Her plea hung in the air, thick with desperation. She watched his shoulders, usually broad and comforting, now slumped in defeat. Jedediah didn't look up. His gaze remained fixed on the table, as if the answers to their predicament lay buried in its grain. "There isn't, Lily-bug. Not one I can see." His voice was raspy, laden with a shame that pricked at Lily more sharply than any anger. She saw the familiar lines of worry etched deeper around his eyes, the tremor in his hand as he finally reached for his cold pipe. "But marrying me off to Silas? He's a brute, Pa. You know what people say about him. You know what he's like." Lily's voice rose, a tremor of frustration now mingling with her fear. She moved closer, trying to catch his eye, to pierce through the wall of his resolve. "He'll make my life a misery. Is that what you want for your own daughter? Finally, Jed lifted his head, his eyes, usually so full of warmth, now clouded with a deep, aching regret. "Do you think this is easy for me, girl? Do you think I don't lie awake nights, wrestling with this? Silas, he holds the deed, Lily. Every cent we've ever earned, every scrap of land, it's all tied up in that debt. He threatened to take everything. Our home. The horses. Even your mother's locket, if I couldn't pay." His voice cracked on the last words, the admission a raw wound. "We can work. We can find a way to earn the money, Pa. Please, just give us time." Lily knelt beside his chair, her hands gripping his arm, trying to infuse him with her own dwindling hope. Jed shook his head, a slow, mournful movement. "You don't know Silas, not really. He doesn't wait. He doesn't offer second chances. He offered this chance. A way to square the ledger, he called it." His eyes, now meeting hers, were haunted. "He said if I refused, he'd make sure we'd never see another sunrise on this land. He'd ruin us, not just financially, but he'd make sure we were run out of this territory, with nothing but the clothes on our backs." A shiver traced its way down Lily's spine. The cold, calculating menace of Silas Blackwood was a well-known tale in these parts. He was a man who reveled in control, who saw people as pawns in his relentless game of acquisition. Jed's fear was palpable, a suffocating presence in the room. "I'm doing this to save us, Lily," Jed insisted, his voice regaining a touch of its usual stubbornness, though tinged with profound sorrow. "To keep a roof over our heads. To keep us from starving. It's the only way, daughter. The only way I could see to protect what little we have left." He pulled his arm gently from her grasp, rising slowly. His back was to her, his posture rigid. "My mind's made up. It has to be this way." The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut, echoing the sound of Lily's heart breaking. The shadow of Bartholomew. Bartholomew's shadow stretched long and dark across the Miller porch, a daily intrusion that grew more frequent, more possessive. He would arrive in the late afternoon, his heavy boots clunking on the wooden steps, a sound that made Lily's stomach clench. He brought with him an unsettling stillness, an air of ownership that permeated the small cabin. He didn't bring gifts, not really. Sometimes a wilted wildflower, plucked carelessly, its petals already browning. More often, he brought only himself, his gaze lingering on Lily with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Just checking on my bride," he'd declare, his voice a low rumble that grated on Lily's nerves. He'd settle into a chair Jedediah offered, his presence filling the small space until it felt suffocating. He'd talk of his ranch, of the expansion he planned, of the children he expected. Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of Lily's hopes, her burgeoning despair a heavy cloak she wore even in the fleeting moments of privacy. Jedediah, ever the appeaser, would nod along, his face a mask of strained politeness. He'd offer Bartholomew coffee, or a slice of whatever meager pie Lily had baked. He never met Lily's eyes during these visits, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken transaction that bound them all. He'd talk of the weather, of the crops, anything to fill the suffocating silence Bartholomew seemed to bring. But Lily knew. She saw the tremor in his hands, the way he flinched when Bartholomew's gaze swept over her. He was ashamed, yes, but more than that, he was trapped. Trapped by the debt, trapped by his own poor choices, trapped by the terrifying inevitability of it all. The wedding preparations, meager as they were, proceeded with a chilling reluctance. A dress, fashioned from a bolt of coarse linen Jedediah had bought from the traveling merchant, lay half-stitched on Lily's bed. Each stitch was a tiny act of surrender, a concession to the inevitable. The thought of wearing it, of walking down the aisle towards Bartholomew, made her hands tremble so violently she often pricked her finger. When she ventured into town for supplies, the glances followed her like specters. The women in their bonnets, their faces etched with a familiar weariness, would offer her small, sympathetic smiles. Mrs. Henderson, the baker, would slip an extra ginger snap into her order. Old Man Hemlock, the general store owner, would give her a discount on flour, his eyes holding a sadness that mirrored her own. These gestures, meant to be kind, only amplified her isolation. They saw her, yes, but they also saw her fate, and in their pity, she felt her own helplessness deepen. They weren't just sympathetic, they were witnesses to her sacrifice, and that made the burden heavier still. One afternoon, Bartholomew found Lily by the creek, her hands plunged into the icy water. He stood above her, his shadow falling across her face. "You'll make a good wife, Lily," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "And a good mother. You have a sturdy build." The words were not a compliment, but a cold assessment, a statement of ownership. Lily felt a tremor run through her, a primal fear that tightened her throat. The creek gurgled indifferently, the only sound to break the oppressive silence. She didn't respond, couldn't. She just stared at the shifting pebbles beneath the water, watching the current carry them away, wishing it could carry her too. The wedding morning. The crisp morning air, usually invigorating, felt like a shroud around Lily as she stood before the cracked mirror. Her simple white dress, a hand-me-down from her mother, hung heavy on her frame. The fabric, once bright, now seemed to absorb the meager light filtering through the cabin window, rendering her an ethereal, almost spectral, figure. A single tear, hot and unwelcome, traced a path down her cheek, leaving a cool trail that quickly vanished. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the small, faded wildflower tucked into her hair, a last vestige of her childhood dreams, now wilting. She looked at her reflection, not truly seeing herself, but rather a stranger caught in a nightmare. Outside, the murmuring of the small crowd grew louder, each voice a hammer blow against the fragile walls of her composure. The entire town of Harmony Creek had gathered, drawn by the morbid spectacle, or perhaps by a sense of duty, a silent witness to a transaction disguised as matrimony. There was no festive cheer, no joyous anticipation. Instead, a palpable heaviness hung in the air, thick with unspoken sympathy and quiet resignation. Children, usually boisterous, clung to their parents' legs, their wide eyes reflecting the somber mood. The scent of pine and damp earth, usually comforting, now seemed to carry the faint metallic tang of dread. Jedediah Miller, his shoulders slumped, fiddled with the brim of his hat, avoiding Lily's gaze. The weight of his debt, and the desperate promise he'd made, pressed down on him, distorting his usually kind features into a mask of shame. He caught sight of Lily through the window, her silhouette framed in the doorway, and a fresh wave of guilt washed over him. He cleared his throat, but no words came. His daughter, his sweet Lily, was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it, bound by his own foolishness and Silas Blackwood's iron will. He clutched the worn leather pouch in his pocket, the one containing the few coins he'd managed to scrape together, a paltry offering against an insurmountable sum. A hush fell over the assembled townsfolk as Silas Blackwood, a predatory smile playing on his lips, stepped forward. His tailored suit, a stark contrast to the rough homespun worn by the others, seemed to amplify his imposing presence. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over the crowd, lingering for a moment on Jedediah, a silent reminder of the power he held. Lily felt a shiver trace down her spine, colder than the morning air. Silas cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the sudden silence. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried across the clearing. "We are gathered here today to witness a union. A union that will bring prosperity and order to Harmony Creek." His gaze, sharp and unwavering, finally settled on Lily, standing frozen in the doorway of the cabin. "Miss Lily Miller, by the agreement of her father, Jedediah Miller, will become my wife." Each word, meticulously enunciated, was a nail hammered into the coffin of her hopes. The air thickened, the collective breath of the town held captive. Lily's world, already teetering, began to spin. A stranger rides in. A billowing dust cloud heralded his approach, a swirling announcement against the vast, azure sky. Then, the horse, a magnificent roan, its coat gleaming like polished mahogany under the midday sun. Astride it, a tall, lean figure emerged, a silhouette etched against distant peaks. A duster billowed gently with his movement, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face, and an unsettling stillness clung to him. This was Jesse, and his arrival in Redemption Gulch was as quiet as it was profound. He reined in at the town's edge, hooves stirring the parched earth. The usual saloon chatter and general store buzz were muted, replaced by a strange solemnity emanating from the settlement's core. Dismounting, Jesse tethered his roan to a weathered post outside the livery, his gaze drawn to a gathering crowd. A makeshift altar stood before the largest building, the town hall, adorned with wilting wildflowers that mirrored the attendees' somber mood. As Jesse approached, boots crunching on gravel, he discerned the cause of the unusual hush, a wedding. Yet this was no joyous affair. The air crackled with palpable, suffocating tension. At the altar stood a man whose presence was as imposing as his dark suit, Silas Blackwood. His flint-like eyes surveyed the sparse congregation with an air of possessive triumph, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, a young woman, Lily, stood with bowed head. Even from a distance, Jesse noticed the tremor in her shoulders, the rigid set of her posture. Her delicate white dress, meant for celebration, seemed to weigh her down, a shroud rather than a garment of joy. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, and though her face was partially veiled, the subtle slump of her form eloquently spoke of her profound unhappiness. She was a bird caught in a snare, her spirit visibly wilting under Silas Blackwood's oppressive gaze. The preacher, a nervous man with a perpetually furrowed brow, cleared his throat, his voice thin against the prairie's vastness. "We are gathered here today," he began, his words faltering as if unsure of their own conviction. Jesse's eyes narrowed, taking in the scene. The faces in the crowd were a mixture of resignation and unease, no smiles, no congratulations. Only the stern, unyielding face of Silas Blackwood radiated anything akin to satisfaction. It wasn't a wedding, it was a transaction, an acquisition. And the prize, the unwilling bride, was suffering in plain sight. A quiet rage began to simmer within Jesse. He'd witnessed enough of life's injustices to recognize one unfolding before him. The girl's distress was a beacon, shining through the ceremony's pretense. Her silence was a scream, her stillness a desperate plea. The preacher droned on, but Jesse no longer heard the words. He only saw Lily's trembling form, felt the weight of her unspoken sorrow. A stark, clear choice presented itself: he could turn away, let the ceremony proceed, remain the stranger who merely rode through. Or he could step forward. The urge to intervene, to disrupt this grim charade, grew stronger with each beat of his heart. It was a feeling he rarely ignored. "I'll take her." The dust cloud, kicked up by the rapid approach, grew into a distinct shape, a lone rider, silhouetted against the unforgiving noon sun. He reined in his horse with a sudden, jarring pull, the animal's hooves digging furrows into the dry earth a stone's throw from the hastily erected altar. The abrupt stop sent a shiver through the small, uncomfortable crowd. Every head turned, every murmur died. Jesse swung himself from the saddle with a fluidity that spoke of countless hours spent astride a horse, his movements economical and purposeful. His spurs clinked a defiant rhythm against the parched ground as he strode, unhurried yet determined, towards the bewildered assembly. He stopped just short of the preacher, his gaze sweeping over Jedediah, then Silas, before finally settling on Lily, who stood pale and resolute beside her intended. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or a fierce protectiveness, crossed his face, gone almost as soon as it appeared. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken questions and mounting tension. "I'll take her." Jesse's voice, rough-hewn and resonant, sliced through the stifling silence. The words, simple yet utterly audacious, hung in the air, echoing the audacity of his arrival. "I'll pay the debt. Every last cent." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Silas Blackwood's florid face contorted, his beady eyes narrowing to venomous slits. "What in the blazes do you think you're doing, cowboy?" he snarled, his voice a low growl that barely masked his fury. He took a step forward, his hand instinctively going to the pistol holstered at his hip. "This is a wedding. This woman is promised." Jedediah Miller, who had been standing like a man carved from stone, flinched. His eyes, clouded with shame and despair only moments before, now widened with a fragile, almost imperceptible flicker of hope. He looked from Jesse's unwavering gaze to Silas's enraged countenance, his heart thrumming a frantic beat against his ribs. The possibility, however remote, of Lily being spared this fate was a jolt, a desperate prayer he hadn't dared to voice. Yet, the sheer impropriety of it, the public defiance, made his cheeks burn. He wanted to speak, to assert some authority, but the words caught in his throat, choked by years of deference to men like Silas. Jesse didn't flinch under Silas's threat. His hand remained at his side, his posture relaxed yet radiating an undeniable power. "The debt, Blackwood. Name your price. I'll double it if I have to, but Lily ain't marrying you." His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held Silas's in a challenging stare. The sun, beating down relentlessly, seemed to magnify the confrontation, casting long, stark shadows that danced with the shifting emotions. A few women in the crowd gasped, while the men shifted uncomfortably, torn between the drama unfolding and the fear of Silas's notorious temper. The preacher, his Bible clutched tight, looked as though he might faint at any moment. This was far from the solemn occasion he had prepared for. The challenge and the draw. The dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight piercing the saloon's grimy windows, illuminating the tension that clung to the air like stale pipe smoke. Jesse leaned against the polished bar, a half-empty glass of amber liquid forgotten beside him. His voice, calm and steady, cut through the murmuring crowd. "Jed's debt, you say? I'll clear it. Every last coin." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over Silas, who stood across the room, flanked by his usual hulking companions. "On one condition." Silas's eyes, cold as chipped ice, narrowed. "And what's that, cowboy?" "Lily's freedom," Jesse stated, his voice unwavering. "She chooses her path, not you. Not her father. She decides." Jedediah, slumped at a nearby table, flinched, his face a mask of shame. He couldn't meet Lily's gaze, nor Jesse's. The offer, so simple yet so profound, felt like a judgment. He had bartered his daughter's future for a handful of silver, and now this stranger was offering a reprieve, but at the cost of Jed's already tattered pride. Silas let out a harsh laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "You think you can just waltz in here and dictate terms to me, Blackwood? That's rich." He pushed off the wall he'd been leaning against, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. "You want to play hero? Fine. Let's settle this man to man." His hand instinctively brushed the worn leather of his gun belt. A quick draw. "My terms." Jesse's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What are the stakes, Silas?" "Your life, if you lose." "And if you win," Silas's lips curled into a sneer, "Lily walks free, and Jed's debt is forgotten." "But you won't win, cowboy." Nobody challenges Silas Blackwood and walks away. He gestured towards the saloon doors. "Outside. Now." A hush fell over the saloon, broken only by the creak of the floorboards as Silas strode towards the exit. Jed, pale and trembling, tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't obey. Lily, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a burgeoning hope, watched Jesse. He met her gaze, a reassuring flicker in his own, before pushing off the bar and following Silas. Outside, the late afternoon sun beat down, casting long shadows. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the scent of impending conflict. Silas stood in the center of the dusty street, his hand hovering over his revolver. Jesse took his position, his posture relaxed, almost casual, yet every muscle in his body seemed poised. The wind stirred the dust, making the tumbleweed skitter across the road. On the count of 3, Silas announced, his voice tight with anticipation. 1. The air crackled. The only sound was the frantic beat of Lily's heart, echoing in her ears. 2. Jesse's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, were fixed on Silas's hand. He breathed slowly, evenly. 3. The word was barely out of Silas's mouth before his hand blurred. But Jesse was faster. A streak of polished steel gleamed in the sunlight. The sharp crack of a gunshot echoed, not from Silas's weapon, but from Jesse's. A cloud of dust erupted just inches from Silas's right foot, kicking up grit onto his boots. His own gun was still half-drawn, frozen in his holster. Silas stared, wide-eyed, at the smoking barrel of Jesse's revolver, then down at the disturbed earth. A cold sweat beaded on his brow. Jesse hadn't aimed to kill, but the message was clear. He could have. Jesse slowly reholstered his weapon, the click of the leather a stark punctuation mark in the sudden silence. "Looks like I win, Silas." His voice was low, calm, utterly devoid of triumph, yet it resonated with an undeniable authority. "Lily's free. And Jed's debt, gone. A new hope blooms." The lamplight in Jed's cabin guttered, painting the familiar room in unfamiliar, dancing shadows. Lily stood near the scarred, rough-hewn table, its surface smoothed by countless touches, while Jed restlessly paced the cramped space, hands clasped behind his back. A palpable weight of unspoken words pressed down on them. At last, Jed halted, his frame stooped, turning to his daughter. His eyes, typically dulled by a mix of fatigue and quiet desperation, now glistened with unshed tears. "Lily," he began, his voice raw, a tremor running through it. I don't know what to say. I've made such a mess." He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to his scuffed boots. "When I thought you were truly gone with that man," he choked, the memory of his terror a fresh, vivid wound, preventing him from finishing the thought. He extended a tentative, trembling hand, then let it fall. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Truly, deeply sorry." Lily watched him, her own emotions a turbulent confluence of relief, anger, and a deep, aching sorrow for the man who was her father. She no longer saw the weak, easily swayed figure who had bartered her away, but a broken, remorseful parent who loved her, however imperfectly. A single tear traced a path down her dust-smudged cheek. "I know, Pa," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know you didn't mean for any of it to happen." She didn't entirely believe the latter half of her statement, but she needed to utter the words, to offer him some sliver of peace, if only for her own sake. Jed looked up, his gaze meeting hers, exposing a raw vulnerability she hadn't witnessed since her mother's death. "He was going to take you," Jed rasped, the words a stark confession. "And I couldn't stop him. I just stood there." He buried his face in his hands, shame racking his slender frame. "I was so scared, Lily. Scared of what he'd do, scared of losing everything. In my fear, I nearly lost you." His voice was muffled, thick with anguish. Thank God for Jesse." At Jesse's name, Lily's gaze drifted beyond her father, towards the cabin door, though Jesse wasn't present. An image of him, standing tall and resolute against Silas's bluster, a beacon of unexpected defiance, bloomed in her mind. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't wavered. He had simply stepped forward, declaring, "I'll take her." The memory sent a shiver through her, not of dread, but of something akin to exhilaration. She had always believed her path was irrevocably set, a journey dictated by circumstance and her father's misfortunes. But Jesse had shattered that notion with a few simple, potent words. He had offered her a choice, a future she hadn't dared to envision. As Jed continued to weep softly, his shoulders shaking with the force of his remorse, Lily's focus remained on the door, on the world beyond, on the man who now symbolized her burgeoning hope. The scent of pine from the cabin walls, the flickering lamplight, the sound of her father's quiet sorrow, all receded into the background. All that remained was the vivid impression of Jesse's steady gaze, his unwavering resolve. A warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the lingering chill of fear and despair. For the first time in a very long while, Lily felt a profound sense of possibility. Her future, once a dark and circuitous road, now stretched before her, uncertain but undeniably brighter, illuminated by the courage of a cowboy who had dared to stand up for her. Standing beside Jesse, she knew, anything was within reach.